Good morning. For the first day in a long time. Don't feel like watching from the sidelines.
Welcome to the Core Conversations podcast by Ampelis, where our goal is to help you fuel, use, and rest your bodies in ways that unlock its innate abilities for physical and mental health. My name is Robbie Harmon, and I'll be your host. Welcome to another episode of Core Conversations, where our goal is to help you fuel, use, and rest your bodies in ways that unlock its innate abilities for physical and mental health. My name is Robbie Harmon. I am your host, and today I get to be your guest as well. This will be a little bit different for us. We're going to do a solo episode here to share some reflections and things that have been really culminating thoughts over the last 7 years of working in this business to try to help people make changes in their life for the better. And so we'll see how this goes, but glad that you're spending the time with me today. And I hope I can share some things that, again, I don't profess to be expert or have mastered any of the things that we'll talk about. But I do hope that some of the stories or some of the principles we'll share today and talk through today will maybe prompt further exploration and maybe some insights that will help you or a family member that you're trying to work with. So our topic for today is one that is just scratching the surface of the process of change, the process of helping somebody or helping yourself to make changes that last, to find more purpose and meaning and happiness. And how do we engage these amazing brains that we've been blessed with in our bodies to really make changes that last and changes that help us to be better, stronger, happier, more energized people. So the thought that I want to talk about really came from a reflection that I had on a recent trip just last week. My wife, Jessica, and I took one of our children, McKay, who's our 14-year-old, on a trip to Alaska. We committed to our children years ago that when they turned 14, we would let them choose somewhere in the world and we would take them there. They had to meet 4 criteria. We're members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And so the criteria for these trips that the kids could choose and plan are that they have to be a location where there's a temple, one of our churches, from our church, one of our temples. Second, there has to be a humanitarian or a service component to the trip. Third, there has to be some interesting history to learn. And fourth, there has to be some form of adventure. So McKay, our son, loves to be outside. He loves to fish. He loves being in the mountains, and he chose Alaska. So last week we took McKay on this long anticipated trip to Alaska. And as we were getting ready to run out the door, I was finishing some work things and grabbed a couple books off the shelf as we ran out the door. 2 of them I had read before. One I had not read. I had seen videos of that summarized that were the genesis of the book. One was a C.S. Lewis book, Mere Christianity. The other one was a book called The Last Lecture by Randy Pausch. And I've seen the video. I've never read the book, but I thought it would be a good one to read because people have told me to read it. And then the last one was The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry, which is a must read. It's an excellent book that I highly recommend to everybody. It's one that I need to read again and again because I am guilty of all the things he talks about in that book. But I started with the Randy Pausch book, The Last Lecture, because I had not read it, like I said. And I was reading it, going through the chapters, and there's some good thoughts, some pretty basic thoughts, but inspiring to hear a man who's on the last leg of his life reflecting on lessons learned and wanting to impart these lessons learned to people that he loves. But my mind started to wander as I was reading the book, and as we're going on this trip with my son, started to have this melding of thought that was really thought related to the work that I do at Ampelis, the work that we do at Ampelis, and the hopes that I had for my son on this trip and beyond. And really 2 thoughts were coming. One was thinking about all these statistics that we're trying to address at Ampelis about what's going on in society. So I've got a couple of them here where we read that 41% of the population reports that they're constantly or almost always connected to the internet on their phones or otherwise. We talk about how and have read and learned about how the teaching of ethics and moral values and principles is declining precipitously in our educational institutions. And we don't talk about things or write about things like bravery and humility and courage and things that really matter to help shape a person. Those things are just not commonly read anymore by the rising generation, and we think it's having an impact. Uh, Another 47% of teenagers don't live with both married parents through the duration of their teenage years. 90% of the population doesn't meet the guidelines for daily fruit or vegetable intake. 88% doesn't meet the threshold for recommended fruit intake on a daily basis. 1.61 is our birth rate, which is below the replacement rate. So we're not growing up in homes with siblings where we're learning to share and to resolve conflict and to laugh and joke and love. It was a much more isolated environment. 45% of the people in the United States identify as religious, which is down from 70% 25 years ago. So we're not having these structured communities where we're sharing and talking about meaningful things, life philosophy and spirituality. 73% of us don't get as much sleep as we ought to. And 76% of us don't get as much movement as we ought to, the federal guidelines for daily exercise. So all of these things kind of combine to say to contribute to what we're dealing with depression and anxiety and chronic illness, physical illness, and 24% of the population reporting that they're very lonely, and 73% of the population being either overweight or obese. All of these things are resulting from these trends. And I just got thinking about McKay that we were with and thinking, what am I doing to help him break free and rise above some of these statistics, to not become part of them or contributing to them, but rather to contribute to the solution or to help reverse these trends. So that was one thought. The other thought I had was a comment that was made by a person I was recently introduced to, who is a rancher and a farmer in Idaho. I was introduced to him by Lon Henderson, who's been on the episode. And this person said to me, as he was hearing about the work that we do at Ampelis in mental health, and we were riding on a side by side, a ranger up in his property, and he said, I believe that a hard day's work leads to a good night's sleep, and that leads to good mental health. And I just thought how true that is. And that is something that maybe we overcomplicate the solution to some of our problems. And we've talked about that on prior episodes. But these two thoughts, hard day's work, a good night's sleep, leads to good mental health, combined with thinking about McKay and how I help him to rise above some of these trends that are really plaguing our society, and we're working to reverse. And the thought came as I was thinking about these two things, and I wrote this just one liner in my notebook that I had, and that was that there is a magnetic pull to the middle. There's a magnetic pull to mediocrity. And my thought was that just too often we feel compelled to blend in rather than to stand out. And that applies in so many ways. That's relevant as I think about my kids and going back to school here at the end of summer. Are they going to stand out, or are they going to blend in when it comes to showing kindness? Are they going to stand out, or are they going to blend in when it comes to taking care of their bodies so they can really perform at a high level in their sports? Are they going to stand out, or are they going to blend in when it comes to their faith and trying to serve and show some sort of religious devotion that will enhance their spirituality and bless their lives for good and their families and future generations? So all of these things were running through my mind, and then I started thinking, well, what is it in my life that has helped me to feel better about myself, to feel more motivated, to have more self-esteem? And it came down to, I think, really the times when I feel productive, when I'm moving forward rather than being stagnant. And you think about how many times, if you've ever been on vacation for too long, or you've had a long, as a kid or a teenager, too many days in a row of sleeping in, of watching television, or not being productive and moving forward in some way, you start to just kind of feel gross and you kind of withdraw a little bit. So is it any wonder, as we think about our kids who maybe sometimes are scrolling too much, or maybe sometimes aren't being challenged to push themselves hard enough in ways that will help them develop new knowledge or skills, or to work hard and go earn money, or whatever it is that they're not doing, that that might cause them to feel withdrawn. I think if we reflect on our own lives, we can probably identify patterns that are relevant for helping our kids. So, with that preamble, the thing I want to talk about today, the thing I want to talk about is one, maybe two steps in this pathway of change that we've identified at Ampelis that includes steps in, starting with vision and visualization. We'll talk about that for sure. Second is self awareness and self reflection. We'll talk about that for sure. And then we get into goal setting and plans. We get into skill development, encouragement, accountability, and giving back and serving. We might not talk about those latter four steps as much as the first two, vision and self assessment, self awareness. And these are things that there is scientific founding behind all of these. And I'm not going to go deep into all of the science. I will go into some. Some of it is just having read so much and having now worked for the last 6 years, more than 6 years at this point, in working with families to perpetuate family culture, working with companies to perpetuate culture change and behavior change, and working with people in an addiction recovery setting to change entrenched behaviors. And same now in depression and anxiety, where I'm not as involved in the day to day working with patients, but in hearing the stories and framing the programs that are helping these people. What I want to talk about today is really a culmination of just lessons learned from both my own experience personally, but experiences in the last 6 years also in helping other people make changes in these areas. So, that phrase I was pondering, that I wrote down in my journal, we call it a Meraki at Ampelis, which is a story for another day. But the phrase magnetic pull to the middle, or the magnetic pull towards mediocrity, I started thinking about what I know, the little that I do know about physics, and it is little. But gravity, where does it come from? When is that gravitational force strongest in physics? And gravity is a function of mass. So the gravity on the earth is a function of the earth's mass, and the closer you are to the mass, the stronger the pull of gravity to the center, to the middle of the earth. So you think about this gravitational force of this massive um, object, the planet Earth, and how it pulls down to the middle, the atmosphere and the ocean and other things that are on the earth. The farther you get up above the earth into the atmosphere, the less that gravitational pull becomes, the less force that it pulls, the less force that it has on you to pull you down to the earth, to the middle, to the core. And I thought that was an interesting place to start this conversation, is thinking about that analogy as we maybe go through this conversation. The gravitational pull of the earth, and the closer you are to the mass, the stronger that gravitational pull is. So the more that we can start to elevate ourselves through the things that we'll talk about today, and other habits or interventions that you might deploy in your own life or with your children, to help them rise above the norm, to rise above the crowd, to rise above the flow of society, the less that gravitational pull will become. It's almost as if it's almost as if making change makes it easier to make subsequent change. We've coined this idea and Ampelis of the time value of change. And this is something that Lon may want to talk about at some point on another episode. So Lon, forgive me for jumping into this topic because I know you'd probably want to. But if you may be familiar with the time value of money, and that is, if you're not, the basic idea is that a dollar today is more valuable than a dollar tomorrow. And that's because you can invest it and you can earn interest on it, and then you can earn interest on that interest. So over time, earning a dollar today, getting paid a dollar today, becomes more valuable than getting paid a dollar in the future, because of that power of compounding interest, earning interest on your dollar, and then the ability to earn interest on that interest. So we, early on in our time at Ampelis, identified this concept of the time value of change. The same principle as it is with money and finance. A change that you make in your life today can be built upon to make and enhance future changes or improvements that you'll make in your life in the future. Therefore, the value of making change now is greater than the value of making change later. Not to suggest in any way that making change at some point later in life isn't important and valuable, but if you do make changes, important changes as it pertains to your happiness, your health, finding and cultivating a sense of meaning and purpose, now you've got more time to build and compound upon those changes and cultivate deeper sense of richness and health in your life. So the time value of change is a powerful concept that further suggests and builds on this analogy. If we can elevate ourselves, lift away from the gravitational pull towards the middle, having more distance from the crowd, the easier it will be for us to then feel emboldened in making subsequent changes. There's going to be less pull societally for social norms or whatever to make subsequent changes that can enhance our life. So where I want to go with this is starting down a road of saying, how do we do this? Because I think all of us have things that we want to change, but change isn't easy. It's something that's difficult for all of us. Sometimes we feel stuck. It's easy to just go with the flow of your life and not disrupt things, but sometimes that keeps us stuck. And I know we see this a lot in these self-defeating behaviors like addiction, where you do get stuck and making change is hard. And it's the easier road is simply just going with the flow and maintaining the status quo. So I don't by any means suggest that what we're talking about today is easy, and that if you do follow some of these steps in this pattern, that you won't stumble and that it won't still be hard. But this is at least a framework you can follow that will help make change more predictable and stickier. So let's start with the conversation on. And I guess there's two other introductory comments that need to be made. As we're talking about this principle of change and creating, as we're going to talk about vision, creating vision, the first step in this pattern of change, I want to reinforce something that we highlighted on an earlier episode, and that was this concept of meaning. So at Ampelis, we use this term meaning to convey something different than pursuing temporal outcomes or just pure happiness. Meaning we define as the development of self, relationships with others, and cultivating of spirituality. That's how you cultivate a sense of meaning, or where it's found when you have those elements present in your life, particularly where you can find those three elements intersecting: development of self, relationships with others, and some sense of spirituality, which could be nature, religion, etc. If you can find the intersection of those things regularly in your life, you're going to most likely find a life that is rich with meaning and purpose and joy. And so as we talk about vision, I think it's important to keep in mind that I want to stay focused on anytime we're having a visioning exercise that's meant to be more holistic, trying to say, I want to address an issue of happiness or meaning. I want to lift out of a state of depression. I want to make sure we include all three elements of that meaning paradigm: development of self, relationship with others, and cultivating spirituality. As opposed to, I want to just improve some skill in one of those areas, such as a vision for an outcome as a young athlete or something, or a vision for your life just economically, trying to improve your financial situation. So I want to stay grounded today in this concept of a more holistic sense of vision and cultivating meaning. We'll talk about why that matters and how that actually can accelerate those more hyper-focused change efforts as well. So that's another foundational point, number one. Let me introduce further this concept that just before we talk about vision, talking about self-esteem, because I think ultimately that's what I was trying to think through with my son McKay, is how do I help him develop a sense of confidence and self-esteem along with a sense of happiness and joy and productivity in his life. So there's a psychologist. Carl Rogers was an American psychologist who spent a lot of time talking about the idea of self-actualization. And so I've kind of adapted some of the things that he used to describe this idea of self-actualization to apply it to our concept and framework of meaning. But this will start to introduce vision, the concept of vision. He talks about the idea of congruence and incongruence. But basically, if you can imagine an idealized version of yourself, and then you can imagine an actual version of yourself. So picture two circles side by side, and sometimes they're overlapping. Sometimes your actual self is very much aligned with the idealized version of who you hope you would become and what you hope you would become. And sometimes it's not. But the degree to which there's overlap between those two circles, or call it more congruence between that idealized version of ourself and the actual version of ourself, the greater our self-esteem and energy and creativity and so forth. The more divergence or incongruence we have in those two circles, the more we're going to feel deflated and withdrawn and discouraged and hopeless. And so part of the process of change and developing more self-esteem and more happiness and confidence is, one, following this pattern, developing a really clear vision of what that idealized self looks like. And if you keep in mind self, others, and spirituality, the three elements of meaning that we've talked about, what is your ideal self in that area of meaning? And then pursue some kind of process of self-reflection or self-assessment where you can look at your actual self and say, where am I relative to that vision? And be honest and candid with yourself about that somehow. Maybe you need help from others. We have some tools that we've developed. In fact, if you DM me on this episode, we'd even invite you to participate and utilize some of these tools. We've created a meaning-centered 360, which is kind of a self-audit where you invite people that know and love you to help you gain more insight into how you're doing in those areas of self development of self, spirituality, and others, and some evidence-based criteria in each of those. And you invite them to give you feedback, and it creates a map for you of where you've got good self-awareness and maybe some gaps in your self-awareness where you might have positive self-perception gaps and negative self-perception gaps. So DM me on this episode, and I'll be happy to share with you a link to participate in that free tool, self-guided tool. But going back to congruence, idealized self, actual self, self-esteem, confidence, energy, happiness result from greater congruence. So once we spend time and get good at creating vision, then we get good at identifying how we're doing relative to that vision. The remaining step is, how do we get good at closing the gap and actually merging those two things so we can become more of that idealized version of ourself? And that process of movement and progress is ultimately where we get joy and satisfaction in life. It's when we feel like we're moving closer towards that idealized version of ourselves. And it's not the achievement of that end state, it's the progress towards that end state that really fills us with greater self-esteem and confidence and a sense of purpose. So let's start with vision and say, if the first step in this is identifying a clear picture of what our ideal self is, how do we pursue vision? What's the science, and how do we make that effective? So I want to start there with a study that I have loved to cite as we talk about this with people. And it was a study that was performed or pursued at the Cleveland Clinic, which is a world-renowned healthcare institution, obviously in Cleveland. And there were some psychologists at the Cleveland Clinic who wanted to test and measure the power of thought and the power of the brain and the way that the brain and thinking can manifest itself in our physical body. And so they gathered their test population, and they broke the study participants into three groups. The first group, they were going to have participate in a finger abduction exercise, where they would have them do this exercise with their finger for 15 minutes a day, 5 days a week, for a 12-week period of time. So group number one is actually doing this exercise. Group number two, they said, we want you to close your eyes and visualize this exercise 5 days a week, 15 minutes, 12 weeks. And we want to measure at the end the difference. And the third group, they measured a test at the beginning, and then they said, come back in 12 weeks and we want to measure your test, but they didn't give them any specific interventions to pursue. So the natural assumption, right, is that the question is, which group will improve the most in the pre-test and the post-test after 12 weeks? And it's natural to come to the conclusion that the group that's actually doing the exercise is going to improve most. And that is in fact what happened in this case. However, the surprise was how much the group improved that was asked just to imagine that they were performing this finger abduction exercise. The group that actually performed the exercise, they improved their finger abduction strength by 53% over that 12-week period of time. The group that did nothing but close their eyes and think about showed a 35% improvement in finger abduction strength. Now, that's a 35% improvement by doing nothing with your physical body and only engaging your mind, thinking about doing this exercise. They actually improved the physical fitness of their body. And then the third group that did a pre-test and a post-test showed no statistically significant difference in their finger abduction strength between the beginning and the end. So what does that mean, and what implications does this have? Well, clearly there's something that we can learn about engaging our minds to think about things that we care about, or things that we want to change, or things that we want to become, to help prime our bodies and our minds to behave and act in ways that are actually consistent with what we hope we can accomplish. So there's all sorts of interesting studies about this. There's others that have been cited. If you've ever read the book The Happiness Advantage, they cite other studies where they had a group of people that were working as housekeeping staff for a hotel, and they told one of the groups that if they told one of the groups how beneficial their work that they were doing as the housekeeping staff was for their physical fitness, that it would help them lose weight, that they would be stronger, etc. And they didn't tell the other group. Well, they noted over the ensuing number of months that the group who believed that their work was actually benefiting them physically actually lost weight on average and improved a whole bunch of other physical measures. Whereas the other group that didn't have that instruction, neither one of them changed any behavior. One was just thinking that what they were doing was good for their body and they were going to lose weight, and they actually did. So this is a very um, interesting concept, but it illustrates for us the importance of engaging our brains as if we're thinking about how to use these tools that God has given us in our bodies to improve our health and our energy and our relationships and the outcomes in our life. It just illustrates how important it is to engage our minds. So let's talk about some strategies that will help us to do that effectively. So the first principle, and I want to do this citing 5 different principles and maybe a little discussion and story about each one. The first principle is an idea. The first principle towards effective visioning or visualizing is going to be the concept of narrowing. So if you've ever run a race, a marathon, a 5K, 10K, half marathon, triathlon, maybe you can relate to this. I've done one marathon. I don't know if I'll do any more. I might do another one. I prefer maybe the half marathon distance or shorter triathlons, more in line with what I have the time to train for. But maybe you can relate to this. You're in the middle of a race. You're starting to feel tired, low energy, fatigued. And you're starting to say, man, this is going to take forever. And slowly that starts to wear on you mentally, physically, and so forth. But then you get to the end and you start to hear the noise of the crowd, and you can start to see in the distance the finish line, or you hear the music that they're playing at the end, and your body is filled with energy, and all of a sudden you can run faster and you're not as fatigued. I know I've had that experience. It was particularly pronounced when I was doing a marathon. I hit that wall they talk about at mile 19, and I was dragging until about a mile left, when I started to see bigger crowds and I could hear music and I could see the finish line in the distance. And I ran that last mile so much faster than the preceding 4 or 5 miles. Simply just, I had a physiological boost because I could see the end. So there's been some interesting work done on this concept of narrowing as it pertains to visualizing. One other study that I'll cite that was very interesting on this topic. There was a study done where a group of researchers brought together some participants in a gym, and they strapped an 18-pound weight on their ankles, and they told them that they wanted them to walk across the distance of the gym. And they instructed one group to not look away from the finish line or the end where they were walking towards, but don't look to your left, don't look to your right, stay straight focused on just that finish line. The other group, they instructed to look around and take in the sights and see what was going on in the gym as they were walking forward. Maybe not surprisingly, those that stayed focused, well, I don't know if it is a surprise. Maybe you would think that those that were distracted would estimate that it was shorter. But what they found was there was a statistically significant difference in the responses of those who stayed focused on the conclusion or the outcome they were achieving. So, principle number one is narrowing, the idea that as we stay focused on an outcome that we're intending to achieve and we visualize that outcome regularly, the perceived effort will be less to actually accomplish it. And it will actually take less effort from us to accomplish it. So, number two, um, the principle of barriers. As we're visioning, I'll start with a story. You may have heard this story, but it's from Michael Phelps, the Olympic swimmer, most decorated Olympian of all times, I believe. But in the 2008 Olympic Games in Beijing, he was preparing for that Olympic event, and his coach would have him not only practice in the pool, but he would meditate and visualize his races in his practice sessions before he ever got to an event. And in the 2008 games, he was preparing for an event, and he dove into the water, into the pool, and immediately his goggles filled with water. And so most of us probably would panic. You can't see, your goggles filled with water, something's throwing you off. It's the biggest stage in the world, moment that you train for as a swimmer, the biggest moment, biggest races, and his goggles fill with water. Well, his coach had invited him in his visualization and meditation in his practices to anticipate and visualize not only the successful outcomes associated with those races, but also any barriers that he might encounter in trying to achieve those outcomes. So he had, in his practice sessions, meditated upon and thought about and visualized what could go wrong and how am I going to respond to it. So instantly, his goggles filled with water, he dives in the pool, his goggles filled with water, and he didn't have to hesitate for one moment because he had trained himself, he had trained his mind to respond immediately by starting to count strokes. So he started counting strokes every length of the pool, and he knew that the later lengths of the pool would be more strokes than the earlier lengths of the pool because he was going to be fatigued. So he would count his strokes, and then he would flip and turn, count his strokes and flip and turn. And even though his goggles were filled with water and couldn't see perfectly, he ended up winning the gold medal. And you see him at the end of this race, he takes off his goggles and he throws them into the pool. Kind of, it looks like a celebration, but he's just won this race with his goggles full of water. So it's kind of a cool story. But the idea here is that as we do pursue any kind of visioning exercise and we think about a change we want to make in our lives, whether that's a change with nutrition or a change in a relationship, a change with your exercise routine or your sleep habits, it's wonderful to think about the outcomes and to picture yourself actually succeeding in those change efforts. And it's equally as important to think about what is going to get in your way, to spend time pondering and visualizing those barriers that you might encounter, so you will train your body to know how to respond when those things happen and it won't throw you off course. So principle number two is visualize and anticipate the barriers to change, not just the successful outcomes you hope to achieve. The third is, this is a word that if you're an athlete or if you've been on an athletic team, whenever your coach says, today we're going to do conditioning, it's a word that just strikes, remorse into the heart of any athlete. It's the least favorite practice day. But the idea of conditioning, right, is that the more you do something, the more you train your body to handle that stress and the stronger you become at dealing with that kind of adversity or strain that you put on your body. So the same thing holds true with our minds. The more we do this kind of exercise, whether it's the first concept of narrowing and focusing on that successful outcome that we want to achieve, or it's thinking about the barriers and how we want to respond to those things that might get in our way, that might happen to throw us off course, the more we do that, the more we condition our minds, the more successful we will be at actually making that change. So frequency and repetition matters a lot in this idea. We can train our brains and we can really change the physiological makeup of our brains. This is the idea of neuroplasticity. So conditioning matters with our brains in this visualization process. Fourth is the principle of process visualization. So we've talked about outcomes visualization, and that is we focus on the end state that we hope to achieve. That is powerful, that is motivating, that helps us change. But if we fail to also focus on and visualize, include in our visioning, not just the what I want to accomplish, but the how am I going to do it, that process, if we fail to include that, the visioning exercise can actually be counterproductive. So there's been some interesting research that shows people who focus only on outcomes visualization actually can have counterproductive impact on their ability to achieve their goals. Because what can happen physiologically is um, our brains don't do a very good job of discerning the difference between reality or just perceived action or perceived accomplishment. If we think about something, our brains can interpret that as actually that thing actually happening, this powerful tool that's inside of our head. So if we dwell too much on accomplishing things that we hope to accomplish, it can actually reduce in a counterproductive way healthy cortisol that is actually motivating to us, that moves us to action. And so when we think about the outcomes, that can be inspiring and hopeful, but we need to marry that with visualizing the process and the steps and the work and imagining ourselves going through those steps effectively, and thinking about those things maintains the appropriate levels of hormones in our body, cortisol and other things that move us to action and help us to be motivated to make changes. So process or principle number 4 is process visualization. So the last principle that I want to talk about is really not anything that's particularly maybe profound, but it is the idea that in our visualization, in our visioning, we need to focus not just on achievement, but on change and becoming. And there's a reason for that. You can let me illustrate with a couple of questions, maybe. So imagine the difference between I want to lose 30 pounds, and you visualize yourself envisioning that goal of losing 30 pounds, versus spending time visioning yourself as I want to become a healthy person who has more energy for my family and my work. There's an example. No, think about the difference between these two things. Again, it goes back to what we were talking about with our brains being tricked and can sometimes be counterproductive when we go through some of these exercises. If I dwell too much on the achievement focused vision, then when I lose those 30 pounds, my brain, it rewards me. I feel great. I feel like I've accomplished my goal, and then I relax. That's why in all of these different studies, you see people that lose weight and they have these weight loss goals. Most of them within a short period of time have gained all of that weight back because they were focused so much on that short-term achievement that once it was accomplished, they kind of let their guard down and all of a sudden they went back into old habits. Whereas focusing on and training our brains to be conditioned towards becoming goals rather than achieving goals, we are constantly pursuing this goal of, I want to have more energy and health and vitality for my work and for my kids so I can be a better husband and a father and better provider or more creative at my work. So hopefully that difference is clear, but that's the last principle that I'll share in this conversation about visioning. Simply that, focus on outcome, focus on the process of becoming and visualizing the thing you want to become, not just the achievement of a measurable objective only. So going back through all these principles, first, the concept of narrowing, staying narrowly focused, regularly thinking about the outcome we hope to achieve and that end, that can cause us to feel that it's less effort required to actually achieve that thing rather than thinking about it once and then being distracted and kind of meandering as we pursue a distant goal that is farther from our thoughts. Narrowing. Principle number 2 is the idea of barriers. We need to vision and visualize not only the things that we hope to accomplish, but also the things that might get in our way and how we hope to respond to them. Principle number 3 is the idea of conditioning. Repetition, repetition, repetition matters a lot, just like it does in sport and physical conditioning and training our brains to think and respond to different cues and stimuli in different ways as we try to pursue greater health or some different changes in our lives. Fourth is the idea of outcomes visualization and process visualization, both being important, but not losing focus on visualizing the process or the work required to achieve the outcome. That's the critical step. And then the fifth is this idea of becoming, not just achieving. Okay, so this is a lot. I'm throwing out a lot of ideas here. There's so many things that we could talk about, and for to avoid this getting lengthy and losing your interest, I'm going to try to wrap up with a couple stories. So I hope I can use these tools with my family. I was invited similar to how I'm extending an invitation to you to think about your life and take time to reflect and take time to envision some things that you hope to change using some of these tools. In 2000, let's see, it would have been 2017, early 2017. I was meeting with a coach named Mitch Mitchell. Mitch is a nickname, but it's Mitch Mitchell, and he was a heaven sent for me. I didn't meet with him that many times, but the handful of times that I did had a profound change on me, particularly one instance when he invited me to think about my life and what I want to accomplish over the next 10 to 15 years. And he invited me to write a letter to myself as if I were writing to myself from the future about all the things that had happened in my life for the last 15 years. And he invited me to be very specific, to think about not only the changes that I made, but the steps along the way. What changes did I make that led to those different outcomes in my life, as specifically as I could? And so I went home, and it would have been early in 2017, so winter, and we lived in Arizona, and I went home to my wife Jessica, and we started talking about this idea, and we decided that we would do this together. So over the course of about 6 months, we would go on date nights and we would keep notes and write down bullet lists of things that we hoped for, and things that we hoped for in our lives. And this included kind of house we wanted to live in, where we thought we would live, what kind of hobbies we would have together and individually, what kind of health we would have, what kind of traditions we would make with our family, at what times. Hence this 14-year-old trip that we just did with our son McKay to Alaska. This is an outgrowth of that visioning exercise. So we spent 6 months doing this, and then we drafted a letter as if we were writing from the future back to our present day self. And we took turns drafting that back and forth, and ultimately concluded a final draft and put it away. But over that period of time, those conversations really started to cement in our minds certain things that we hoped would happen in our life, that we would really desire, that we think would be good for our relationship, for our personal health and spirituality and our faith, and for our family. So fast forward now to it would have been April of 2018. I was in Boise, Idaho. I was there for some business meetings, and I went for a walk after evening meetings concluded, and walk along the Boise River. And I was walking down this paved path, and I have a picture of this on my phone, but I I just felt compelled to look at the river, and there was a little path that went down through the trees next to the river instead of on this paved road. And I paused and I thought, "Ah, this kind of makes me feel like it's time to make a change in my life." One of the things that we had talked about in our vision letter, that we had spent that much time really pondering, was that we desired to, at some point in the near future, leave the safe, predictable, although lucrative corporate world, private equity backed healthcare world, and start a business that was trying to make significant contributions in the care of other people with a small group of people who we loved. And I looked down that path, and that's what just kept going through my mind. That little cue, or that little stimulus in my evening, prompted me to just have this strong feelings about, it's time. It's time to do that. And so I go home, and it was not any more than 3 days later, Jessica and I went into a weekend general conference, which is a semi-annual gathering in our church where we listen to our church leaders give counsel and direction. And we had been praying for some guidance on, we've had these feelings. We'd also talked about wanting potentially to move back to Utah after being away for almost 13 years, to be closer to family, where we could create some spontaneous memories with their grandparents. And so we started just pondering all this going into this weekend. And we said, well, let's pray about what we should do about these feelings, if it's time for us to act and to move and make these changes. So we go into a weekend praying about this. And then on a Saturday morning, I went outside in our front yard, and we had some citrus trees, and I picked an orange, and my neighbor drove by in a car, and he saw me, and then he backed up and said, "Hey, Robbie, you don't happen to know anybody who's thinking about selling, or you don't know anybody who's selling a house in the neighborhood, do you?" And I said, "I don't know. Let me go ask Jessica. Let me go ask my wife." And so I went inside and told Jessica, and we said, "Well, is it a coincidence that this happened, that, very time we're praying about what we should do and if we should move to Utah and or not. And so we called our neighbor back and we said, you can't tell anybody in the neighborhood that we're thinking about this yet, but we just barely started thinking about selling our home and moving back to Utah. So we invited him and this person he was with to come over and see the house. And they came in, and a day later they extended an offer to buy our house. And 3 days later we were under contract. And 2 months later we were living in Utah. And I share that story only to say, had we not spent the time actually thinking about and pondering what we wanted in life, first of all, the Boise River thing, that wouldn't have prompted any thoughts. Second of all, we probably wouldn't have gone into that weekend praying about and thinking about, and then subsequently been open to something like that was somewhat of a spontaneous, unanticipated move, had we not already prepared ourselves to pursue and respond to opportunities that would move us in a direction of what we really hope to accomplish as a family. So that was a powerful thing for me. And then subsequently, we talked about building a business and going through a period of sacrifice where we're trying to build a small business. And that's been a hard thing as a family, but it has also been strengthening to say, this is what we wanted. And there are attributes that are being developed in our family by having to delay things that we want with our children and otherwise. So that again, that vision exercise has helped us now navigate a necessary part of building a business that has required sacrifice in ways that have been very productive and reassuring. There's been other things that have been hopeful. We talked about tennis and other things being part of our life at some point, and hobbies that we would like to pursue. And just recently we were blessed to move into a home that had a tennis court. And so we're now have that opportunity and can be playing tennis as a family or individually, and just starting to see some of these things that made their way into our vision letter actually transpiring. Because as we now are presented with, life happens and you're presented with intersections and challenges, but we've trained ourselves to some extent to now respond to those in ways that move us closer towards envisioned outcomes that we hoped we would achieve in our life. And that's just been a powerful thing for us as a family. So where I'm going with all of this, I guess today is more than anything a reflection on things that I hope for my children. I hope for my children, and maybe this prompted something for some of you that you can do with your families or your loved ones or even in your own life. I hope there's a prompt in here to think more intentionally about things you hope to achieve in your life. And I'm not talking about the idea of just like uh, optimism. There was we went to a seminar or a leadership conference at Harvard. It was Leadership and Happiness Symposium is what it was called. And there was one of the presenters who talked about hopefulness being the biggest predictor of of the ability to overcome different mental illness. And she defined hopefulness as not just positively thinking about um, an outcome, but it was the idea of both a goal or positive thinking plus agency. So hopefulness, as she defined it, meant I've got to have a belief or a hope or a goal that I want to achieve, but I also have to have something that helps me believe I can actually make changes in my life that will help me accomplish it. Because she said the idea of just optimism, absent a belief that you can actually affect the changes that will lead to that outcome, doesn't yield any kind of benefit. But she did define hopefulness in this way. So what I hope is that I can inspire in my family and in people that we get to the blessing of engaging with at Ampelis and in our work, and even in the projects that we're doing with Core 7, giving tools beyond just a supplement to help people cultivate hope, clear goals and beliefs, tools to actually visualize those and increase the likelihood that you will achieve them, but also support and resources that will give you confidence that you can actually make changes that will lead to those outcomes, that will help you successfully accomplish some of those changes. And that's the idea of agency. So I hope that I can help you and my family create hope, that you can see that there are tools, scientifically backed tools, that will help you to make lasting changes in your life, to not blend in, going back to our first analogy here with gravity and the earth, but to have the confidence to dare to be different and to stand out, whether that's in a social context or in a pursuit of an athletic context or in making a change with an addiction or a food habit or something. But being willing to be different, I think is a powerful thing. And these tools can help you do that. And I hope that this has been helpful. I want to conclude with 2 quotes. The first is from Nelson Mandela, and I haven't been able to source this exactly where it came from, but it's been attributed to him in one of his inaugural speeches. And he says this: "Our deepest fear is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. It is our light, not our darkness, that most frightens us. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, and fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. Your playing small doesn't serve the world. There's nothing enlightened about shrinking so that other people won't feel insecure around you. You were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within us. It's not just in some of us, it's in everyone. And as we let our own light shine, we consciously give other people permission to do the same. As we are liberated from our own fear, our presence automatically liberates others." I love this. I love this. I love this idea of being willing to be different and not being afraid or thinking that other people are going to be insecure if we or judge us for trying to be bold in our changes. I love this quote. That's inspired me. It was shared with me by a missionary when I was 19 years old, serving as a mission in Portland, Oregon, and I love it. The second quote is from Maya Angelou, and I think I'm saying that right. I'm not entirely sure, but she was a memoirist and poet and author during the civil rights movement. And she says this: "If you are always trying to be normal, you will never know how amazing you can be." And I hope that this discussion today maybe gives you a little bit of confidence that you can use some of these tools to actually make changes, to stand out, to be different, and accomplish some of your hopes and dreams. We're happy to help. Please reach out to us. Let us know if we can play a part in your journey. We're excited to share with you some of the things we've been working on. And please join us again for another episode of Core Conversations.
Oh, yeah. Good morning. For the first day in a long time, don't feel like watching from the sidelines.